Snow fell in slow, heavy flakes over the rutted wagon road that snaked through the white prairie toward a burning orange sunset. Each flake drifted down like ash from some distant fire, silent and relentless, blanketing the mud-slashed track in a shroud that muffled even the creak of wooden wheels. A small handcart labored along the road, piled with blankets gone stiff with frost, a dented kettle, and a sack of dried beans that had seen better months. Beside the cart limped a worn farm horse ribs, visible through a dull coat, a bloody cut gaping on its foreleg, where barbed wire had torn through hide and tangled in the matted mane. Rose Holloway stood in the center of the road, her skirt stiff with frost and mud, a newborn wrapped tight in her arms. The baby's face was pale lips, faintly blue, and his breath came in shallow, rapid puffs that Rose could feel against her collarbone. Behind her crowded 3 children, Owen gangly, and 13, his coat sleeves too short for his growing arms. Lottie, 9 years old, with chapped cheeks and eyes that had seen too much. And Martin, barely 6, thin as a fence post and shivering despite the wool scarf wound twice around his neck. There was nothing behind them but a line of smoke on the horizon, where their homestead used to be, the barn and cabin reduced to blackened timbers and ash by men who wanted the land more than they cared about the lives upon it. Hoofbeats thudded through the snow, muffled but unmistakable. For an instant Rose went rigid, her body braced for the appearance of Kincaid's riders' men, who wore long coats with brass buttons and carried rifles slung carelessly across their saddles, men who laughed when they burned what you built. Her free hand went to the hem of her skirt, where several folded pages crinkled against her thigh, sewn into the petticoat with hurried stitches. Those pages were all that remained of her husband's final desperate gamble. Instead of a mob, a single Lakota warrior rode out of the swirling flurries framed against the fire-colored sky. Enepe sat straight-backed on a bay gelding, long dark hair falling loose under a tall war bonnet of white feathers, tipped in black beadwork bright against buckskin that was worn but carefully kept. He reined in, the horse's breath steaming, and took in the wagon and the wounded horse, the desperate family standing exposed on the open road with nowhere to hide and no strength left to run. "If you stay here," he said in careful English, each word shaped with precision, "you will die in the cold before the moon is high." Rose's voice cracked raw from smoke and exhaustion. "We have nowhere left." Enepe's gaze moved from the baby's pale face to the children's raw hands, their fingers red and swollen from gripping frozen wood, and finally to the cut on the horse's leg, still oozing blood into the snow. Snow clung to his braids and shoulders, melting slowly in the last rays of the sunset. Far off, a rifle shot echoed across the prairie, someone taking pot shots at shapes on the road testing range, or simply amusing themselves. "Then you have me," he said simply, turning his horse to lead them off the exposed track. Just as he moved, a second bullet hissed past Rose's head and thudded into a tree trunk beside her bark, exploding in a spray of splinters. Lottie screamed. Owen threw himself over Martin, dragging him down into the snow. Rose clutched the baby tighter and dropped to one knee, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. Enepe wheeled his horse, placing himself between the family and the direction of the shot. He did not draw a weapon. He simply sat there, a silhouette against the dying light, daring the shooter to try again. No third shot came. Whoever it was had made their point. "Follow close," Enepe said over his shoulder. "Do not lag. Do not light a fire. If you hear hoofbeats, you hide in the brush and you do not make a sound." Rose nodded, hauling Owen and Martin to their feet. She took up the reins of the limping horse and urged the cart forward, following the bay gelding into the swirling white, into the unknown, because the known had already burned to ash behind her. Enepe guided the wagon along a narrow, half-hidden trail that twisted through stands of cottonwood and willow, following the course of a creek that glinted silver under the rising moon. The same water Victor Kincaid was fencing and hoarding. The horse stumbled in the ruts, hooves slipping on ice-slicked stones. Owen strained against the shaft's boots, sliding, trying to keep the cart from tipping sideways into the brush. Enepai dismounted without a word and put his shoulder to the cart, pushing through the slush until they reached the shelter of the trees, where the snow was thinner and the wind could not cut straight through. Beyond the creek lay his people's small winter camps, a ring of low lodges, half buried in snow smoke, threading from smoke holes in thin, careful lines. Men stepped out with bows and rifles at the sight of the wagon faces, hard with suspicion. Enepei's uncle Magisi stood at their head hair gray and braided with strips of red cloth eyes, sharp as a hawk's. He was a man who had seen promises broken too many times to trust easily. A white woman and her young... Magisi said, his voice flat. "You bring trouble, nephew." Rose stepped forward, placing herself in front of her children, heart pounding but chin raised. She had spent the last weeks being pushed off land, turned from doorways, watched by eyes that measured how much food she would cost, and found her wanting. She expected the same here. "My baby is fevered," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We only ask a place out of the wind. By morning we will move on." Enepei looked at his uncle, then at the baby in Rose's arms, and the small face slack with exhaustion and illness. "One night," he said. "That is all we ask." Magisi's jaw worked as if chewing something bitter. Then Ayana, Magisi's granddaughter, a young woman with quick hands and a sharper tongue, stepped from a lodge with a blanket and laid it over Rose's shoulders, muttering that the baby's lips were too pale to wait on arguments. Magisi relented, grudging but practical. One lodge, one night. If Kincaid's men come looking, she leaves before they arrive. Inside the lodge, warmth crept back into Rose's hands as Ayana showed her how to heat small stones in the fire and tuck them near the newborn's feet, wrapped in scraps of rabbit fur. Lottie and Martin sat with Lakota children near the fire, trading a few words in the awkward mix of English and hand signs, sharing tough strips of dried meat that had to be chewed slowly to soften. Through fragments of talk, Rose learned that Kincaid's dams and fences had strangled not just homesteads, but old Lakota grazing lands, cutting off access to water that had flowed freely for generations. The same creek that once watered their horses now ran dry for miles, choked by timber and rock, piled high upstream. Through small, flinty answers, Enepei learned in turn that Rose's husband Lucian had died under Kincaid's cattle after trying to cut through a line of barbed wire to reach water. The official word was accident. The truth was muddier, buried under threats and bribes. What Enepei did not yet know was that hidden inside Rose's petticoat, sewn with trembling fingers for the night before the cattle stampeded Lucian to death, were several pages torn from Kincaid's ledger entries that might prove forged water rights, quiet bribes to the land office, and payments made to men who asked no questions. Lucian's last desperate attempt to gather proof. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the cottonwoods. Somewhere in the dark, a wolf howled back, long and lonely. The night passed without incident, but Rose barely slept. Every creak of the lodge poles, every shift of the wind, made her reach for the baby to check his breathing. Enepei sat near the entrance rifle across his knees, watching the darkness beyond the fire's glow. Twice he rose and stepped outside, listening, and then returned without comment. By dawn, the baby's fever had broken. His color was better, his breathing deeper. Ayana brought a clay bowl of thin broth made from bone marrow and wild onion, and Rose fed him with a rag dipped in the liquid, coaxing small swallows. Owen helped the Lakota boys water the horses at the creek, chipping through a thin crust of ice with the blunt end of an axe. Lottie sat with the women, learning how to braid strips of sinew into cord, her fingers clumsy at first, but gaining confidence. Martin fell asleep again, curled against a Lakota grandmother who sang softly under her breath while stitching moccasins with careful, even stitches. Enepei found Rose sitting outside the lodge, staring at the line of smoke on the horizon where her home had been. He crouched beside her, not speaking at first, just sharing the silence. The morning air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. "Your husband," he said finally. "He worked for Kincaid." Rose's hands tightened on the blanket around her shoulders. "He worked as a surveyor. Kincaid hired him to plan the dam. Lucian thought it was honest work, better water control, fewer floods. He did not know what Kincaid intended until it was too late." What did Kincaid intend? To choke the valley, to force everyone out so he could buy the land for nothing. She paused, then added quietly, "Lucian tried to walk away. Kincaid made it clear that walking away was not an option. So Lucian started copying pages from the ledger, proof of bribes, forged claims payments to men who looked the other way. He was going to take it to the territorial judge. And Kincaid found out." Rose nodded. "The cattle stampede was no accident. They drove the herd straight through our fence in the middle of the night. Lucian was trying to save the milk cow. He never had a chance." Enepe was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "My younger brother died when one of Kincaid's dams burst last spring. The water came down the canyon like a wall, took horses, lodges, everything in its path. Kincaid called it an act of nature. But the dam was built poorly in the wrong place. No one who knew the land would have put it there." Rose turned to look at him. "I am sorry." "So am I." He met her eyes. But sorrow does not stop men like Kincaid. Only proof does. And even then, sometimes, not enough. Before Rose could reply, a shout went up from the far side of the camp. Men were running toward the creek, pointing at the ground. Fresh horse tracks circled the camp close enough that snow had been kicked onto the lodge walls. One of the men held up a brass button, and the kind that fastened the long coats worn by Kincaid's trail hands. McGeesy's patience ended. He strode to the lodge where Rose and her children had slept and spoke in Lakota, his voice hard. Ayanna translated her own voice tight with regret. "Our winter food is thin. Our problems are already heavy. We will not carry white quarrels too. You must leave before full daylight draws more riders." Rose did not argue. She had no right to endanger these people further. She strapped the baby to her chest, with a length of cloth settled the younger children on the wagon, and almost broke as she took up the worn reins again. The wind bit through her patched coat. The road back to Sapphire Springs was little more than churned mud and ice stretching out like a sentence with no end. Enepe rode beside the wagon uneasy. He could feel the valley tightening around them like more of Kincaid's wire, each mile narrower, each choice sharper. They crested a small rise, and 3 mounted men suddenly rose from a drainage ditch ahead, rifles already up blocking the road. Rusty Joe Kincaid's scar-faced enforcer grinned under his hat-brim, tobacco staining his teeth. The scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, pulling his smile into a permanent sneer. "Morning, missus," he drawled. "Boss says you got something of his tucked away. Ledger scraps. I'll just take 'em back, and we'll call your little trespass a misunderstanding." His eyes flicked to Enepe. "You can ride on Warrior. No call to bleed for her mistakes." Enepe saw where Rusty Joe's partner was aiming straight at the baby strapped against Rose's chest. The man's finger was already curled around the trigger, waiting for the order. "Point the gun at me," Enepe said quietly. "Not at a child." Rusty Joe's grin widened. "Now why would I do that when this works so much better?" He fired. The shot exploded the wagon's water barrel. Staves burst, soaking Owen and showering the children with splinters and freezing water. The horse reared, nearly tipping the cart. Rose threw herself over the baby, her body a shield, her mind blank with terror. Enepe spurred forward, his own rifle already in his hands. The brief gunfight was brutal and close. He dropped one rider with a careful shot to the shoulder that sent the man tumbling into the snow, screaming and clutching his arm. Rusty Joe's second bullet creased Ennepe's side, a hot line of fire that soaked his shirt with blood. But he stayed in the saddle long enough to put a round through the gun hand of another attacker, sending that man's weapon spinning away into the brush. Rusty Joe wheeled his horse and retreated, shouting over his shoulder, "Kincaid will pay silver for your scalp, Lakota, and double for the woman and her papers." The sound of hoofbeats faded into the trees, leaving only the wind and the labored breathing of frightened people. Ennepe dismounted, one hand pressed to his side, blood seeping between his fingers. Owen scrambled out of the wagon, soaked and shaking. Lottie was crying quiet sobs she tried to muffle with her sleeve. Martin clung to Rose's skirt, too scared to make a sound. Rose looked at Ennepe, and then at the children, then at the ruined water barrel. They had no water, no safe place to go, and men with guns hunting them. "Why?" she asked, her voice raw. "Why does he care so much about a few pages?" Ennepe leaned against the wagon, breathing hard. "Because those pages can take everything from him: land, power, respect. Men like Kincaid would rather kill than lose what they stole." Rose was silent for a long moment. Then she reached down and tore open the hem of her petticoat, pulling out the folded pages. They were creased and stained, but the ink was still clear. "Lucian tore these from Kincaid's ledger the night before he died," she said. "Entries that prove forged water rights, bribes paid to the land office, payments to men who helped him squeeze out homesteaders." She looked at Ennepe. "He sewed them into my clothes and made me promise to get them to a judge if anything happened to him." Ennepe took the pages, scanning the neat rows of numbers and names. His jaw tightened. Among the entries were payments marked dam construction and channel redirection work done in locations that matched the site where his brother had died. "This is more than proof of theft," he said slowly. "This is proof of murder." Rose nodded. "That is why Kincaid will not stop until he has them back, or until we are dead." Owen, still shivering in his wet coat, spoke up. "So what do we do?" Ennepe looked at the boy, then at Rose, then at the pages in his hand. "We make sure these reach someone who can use them, before Kincaid buries us the way he buried your father. To make those pages matter, they needed witnesses. The only place with a telegraph, a proper records room, and anyone educated enough to copy the documents was Sapphire Springs, Victor Kincaid's town. A place where his riders drank in the saloons, his money paid the shopkeepers, and his word was law. Ennepe and Rose agreed on a plan. They would not roll openly down Main Street and invite another ambush. Instead, they would shelter the wagon in a frozen ravine outside town and walk in after dark, keeping to the cottonwoods that followed the creek. It was risky, but staying in the open was suicide. They found a narrow gully choked with brush and pulled the wagon into it, covering the white canvas with branches. The horse was too lame to travel further, so they left it with a pile of dried grass and a prayer that it would still be alive when they returned. Ennepe carried Martin on his hip when the boy's legs gave out, his small body limp with exhaustion. Rose walked with the baby pressed to her chest, Owen and Lottie flanking her, watching shadows for riders. The moon was high and bright, turning the snow blue and making every moving branch look like a man with a rifle. Sapphire Springs was a smear of lantern light and noise in the snow. Men staggered out of the saloon, spur chains clinking, voices loud with drink. A freight wagon rattled past, its wheels crunching ice. The driver hunched low against the cold. Ennepe pushed Rose gently into the gap between two buildings as a pair of Kincaid's riders clattered by, laughing about that red man with a sure aim, and placing bets on how long it would take to run him down. Their first stop was the small, cramped house of Dr. Nehemiah Clark, a thin, balding man who once risked Kincaid's anger to treat sick Lakota children during a measles outbreak. Nehemiah answered the door in his shirt-sleeve spectacles perched on his nose, a medical text open on the table behind him. He took one look at the group on his doorstep, muddy, bloody, desperate, and stepped aside without a word. Inside, he examined the baby in the yellow lamplight, listening to the small chest with a wooden stethoscope, noting the fever but clear lungs. He mixed willow bark tea and showed Rose how to feed it with a spoon, a few drops at a time. When Rose quietly mentioned the ledger pages, his face went still. Then he closed the book on his table and said, "You need Helene Rosemont, the schoolteacher. She has ink paper and a mind sharp enough to see what those pages mean." He sent them as quickly as he dared to the next ally, Helene Rosemont, the schoolteacher. Her one-room schoolhouse stood at the edge of town's slate boards, stacked against the wall. Ink bottles stoppered tight against the cold. Helene was a woman in her 40s, sharp-eyed and tired of watching her pupils arrive with stories of dry wells, dead cattle, and fathers who drank because they had lost everything. When she saw the ledger pages spread out on her desk, she did not waste time on speeches or moral outrage. "We copy these," she said, already reaching for paper and ink. "One set stays locked in my desk. One goes east by telegraph code as soon as we can trust the operator." While she wrote, copying each entry with careful precision, Rose kept lookout at the frosted window, watching the street for movement. Enepe stood near the door, listening to distant hoofbeats, one hand on the rifle slung across his chest. Owen and Lottie dozed on benches, heads resting against each other. The baby's breathing finally settled into a slow, steady rhythm. It took 2 hours. By the time Helene finished, her hand was cramped and ink-stained, but 3 complete copies lay drying on the desk. She folded one set and locked it in a metal box under a loose floorboard. The second set she gave to Nehemiah, who would hide it in his clinic. The third she handed back to Rose. "Keep this on you," she said. "If Kincaid gets 1 copy, we still have 2 more. If he gets 2, we still have 1. He has to find all 3 to bury this." Rose tucked the pages back into her petticoat, stitching the hem closed with needle and thread Helene provided. Her hands shook, but the stitches held. Staying in town any longer was a gamble with the fuse already lit. They slipped out the back door of the schoolhouse just as a group of riders turned onto the street lanterns swinging. Over the next days, the valley tightened like a noose. Kincaid finished a higher dam upstream, starving the creek that fed both the Lakota camp and the scattered homesteads. Ice no longer hid running water underneath. Some stretches were simply dry, the mud beneath, frozen into lifeless ruts. Barbed wire fences ran like scars across old game trails, catching deer hides, tearing clothing, cutting horses that strayed too close. Enepe rode with McGeesy's men to chip channels through ice, where they could shoulders aching from swinging an axe in the bitter cold. He returned one afternoon with his palms torn and bloody from grabbing bare wire to free Rose's lame horse, when it snagged itself again on a fence strand, panicking and thrashing until the barbs had torn deep. That night, by the smoky fire, in a half-collapsed sod shed where they had taken shelter, Rose watched him try to curl his raw hands into fists and fail. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandages he had wrapped around his palms. She fished a worn harness strap from the wagon, sliced it into narrow lengths with a kitchen knife, and called him over. "Hold still," she said. She wrapped his palms in folded leather, fitting each strip between fingers so the barbs would strike animal hide, not his own flesh. Her fingers moved with brisk, farm-wife precision. But there was no mistaking the way she studied his knuckles, the old scars crisscrossing the backs of his hands, the fresh cuts still oozing. When she tightened the last knot, their hands locked for a second palm to palm through the leather. "You cannot keep bleeding every time someone stretches wire," she muttered. He flexed cautiously, testing the wraps. "This will help," he admitted. "On the dam, or wherever we must cut next." Rose met his eyes. "You do not owe us this. You could ride away and be safer. So could you, he replied. But you are still here. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned away, busying herself with the fire. But the air between them had shifted, something unspoken acknowledged. 2 days later, Helene quietly visited poor farmers scattered across the valley, men like Owen Daly, whose well had run dry, and families who had watched their cattle die of thirst within sight of Kincaid's fenced creek. She showed them partial copies of Kincaid's accounts, her voice low and urgent. These numbers tell the story. He's not just taking water. He is stealing your future. In a shadowed barn, 6 men gathered around a lantern, passing the pages hand to hand. One farmer, a weathered man named Silas, squinted at the entries. That is my name there. Payment for access easement. I never saw a dime. Because it is forged, Helene said. Kincaid used your name to make his land grab look legal. Silas's jaw tightened. What do we do about it? We stand together. When the time comes, you testify. You speak the truth loud enough that even the territorial governor cannot ignore it. Nehemiah talked in private with the town's more honest shopkeepers, the ones who still remembered when Sapphire Springs was more than Kincaid's company town. In the back room of a dry goods store, he laid out medical records showing injuries from wire cuts, livestock deaths from dehydration, children suffering from tainted water. This is not just economics, Nehemiah said. This is public health. If Kincaid controls, all the water disease will follow. Cholera, dysentery. We will lose more than our livelihoods. The shopkeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Pritchard, nodded slowly. I have seen it before. In the mining camps. When water goes bad, people die by the dozen. They began to see that if Kincaid controlled all water, none of them were safe. A man who would burn out a widow would not hesitate to ruin a merchant or foreclose on a blacksmith. But Kincaid and his foreman, Strong Steve, were not blind. They heard the talk, felt the tension in the air, like the charge before a lightning strike. Kincaid ordered more riders on patrol and hinted at a spring adjustment that would wash away his remaining problems when the thaw came. Strong Steve, a broad-shouldered man with a face like weathered stone, said little, but watched everything. He had worked for Kincaid for 5 years and knew how his boss dealt with obstacles. One evening, as he supervised repairs to a fence line, he found himself staring at the distant smoke from the Holloway homestead ruins. Something about it bothered him, a memory nagging at the edge of his mind. That night, he pulled out an old daguerreotype from his saddlebag. It showed 2 young men in surveyor's gear, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. One was Steve himself, 20 years younger. The other was Lucian Holloway. They had worked together on a railroad survey in the Colorado Territory before Steve drifted into ranch work and Lucian settled down to farm. The memory was bittersweet. When Steve heard Lucian had died in a stampede, he had written it off as bad luck. Now, watching Kincaid's casual cruelty, he began to wonder. Enepe pushed McGeesy to stand with the homesteaders against the dams, arguing that their survival was linked. But McGeesy refused, sick of treaties broken and promises drowned in bureaucracy. We have been betrayed by white promises before, he said bitterly. Why should this time be different? The split between them grew like a crack in river ice, visible and dangerous. Ayanna, caught between her loyalty to her grandfather and her growing respect for Rose's family, became quieter, more withdrawn. She watched from the edges, her face unreadable. One evening, as Enepe returned from another futile attempt to convince his uncle, he found Rose sitting alone outside the shed, staring at the darkening sky. The children were asleep inside, bundled together for warmth. He will not listen, Enepe said, slumping down beside her. Can you blame him? Rose replied. I would not trust us either if I were in his place. Then what do we do? Rose was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "We do what Lucian should have done from the start. We stop asking permission and we act. If the dam breaks the wrong way, it will kill everyone, his people and mine. Maybe that is reason enough." Enipe nodded slowly. Maybe. They sat in silence, shoulders almost touching, watching the first stars appear. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped and another answered. The valley was full of voices calling out in the dark, hoping someone would answer back. 3 days before the expected thaw, Enipe took Rose out to a clearing to teach her to shoot properly. Owen came along eager to learn. Enipe set up targets, chunks of wood propped against a fallen log, and handed Rose a Winchester rifle. "Hold it firm against your shoulder," he said, standing close behind her, adjusting her grip. "The recoil will bruise you if you hold it loose." Rose sighted down the barrel, feeling the weight of the weapon, the cold metal under her fingers. She squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt 2 feet to the left of the target. "You are pulling," Enipe said. "Squeeze gentle, like you are coaxing, not forcing." She tried again. This time the bullet clipped the edge of the wood, sending splinters flying. Owen whooped. Rose allowed herself a small smile. "Better," Enipe said. "But in a fight your hands will shake. Your heart will pound so loud you will hear nothing else. You must practice until it is memory, not thought." They spent an hour there, burning through precious ammunition until Rose could hit the target 3 times out of 5. Owen proved a natural shot, steady-handed and patient. When they walked back to the shed, Rose felt a new kind of confidence settling into her bones. She was not helpless. She could protect her children if it came to that. That night, as she cleaned the rifle by firelight, Enipe sat across from her, stitching a torn moccasin. The silence between them was comfortable, companionable. "Thank you," Rose said quietly, "for teaching me. You are a quick study." "I had to be. After Lucian died, I realized no one was coming to save us. If we were going to survive, I had to learn fast." Enipe looked up from his stitching. "You remind me of my mother. She could shoot trap ride as well as any man. My father used to say she was the strongest person he ever met." Rose felt warmth spread through her chest. "That is high praise. It is the truth." Their eyes held for a moment, and Rose felt something shift again, something deeper than gratitude or alliance. She looked away first, focusing on the rifle, but her heart was beating faster. Seeking more than scraps of proof, Helene suggested they search the land office records. The documents filed there would show the original water rights, the approved dam designs, and any legal changes Kincaid had made or forged. Late one afternoon, while Kincaid attended a cattle auction in a neighboring county, Helene, Rose, and Enipe slipped into the back room of the squat, clapboard building that served as both telegraph station and land office. The clerk, a nervous man named Horace, was persuaded to step out for coffee by Nehemiah, who kept him occupied with a long-winded story about a patient's mysterious ailment. In dust-choked drawers, they found survey maps of the valley, some dating back a decade. On the earliest sheets, the creek ran wide and shared the proposed dam marked small with spillways that would leave enough water below for everyone. On newer maps, a thicker line showed a higher dam and a diverted channel cutting straight through low ground where Lakota burial scaffold stood and where the Holloway homestead used to sit. Next to the redraw was a set of neat initials, L.H. Rose froze. "Lucian Holloway," she whispered. They pulled more records. Among them were notes from Kincaid's lawyer referencing payments to Lucian for consulting on water management, followed by a terse line about disagreements and refusing further compensation. Another entry, dated 2 weeks before Lucian's death, read simply, "Final payment for silence." Back at Nehemiah's house, they spread the land office copies beside the stolen ledger pages. The pattern became clear. Lucian had helped design the expanded dam and the dangerous relief channel. After a dam failure killed several Lakota ponies and one young boy, Ennepe's little brother Lucian had tried to pull away, sickened by what he had helped create. Then he began collecting evidence, instead copying ledger entries and drafting a letter to the territorial judge that was never sent. Kincaid's final payment to him was labeled only silence. Whether Lucian refused the money or accepted it before changing his mind, the records did not say. But the cattle stampede came 3 nights later. Ennepe stared at Lucian's initials until the ink seemed to blur, his hands still wrapped in leather strips clenched into fists. The room felt suddenly too small, the air too thick. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "Your husband drew the line that took my brother's life," he said, voice flat and hard. Rose gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles were white. Tears pricked her eyes, but she forced them back. He came home that night sick at what he had signed. She insisted, her voice shaking. He swore he would testify if a judge ever listened. He never got the chance. Because Kincaid killed him before he could. Yes. Rose's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Lucian made a mistake, a terrible one. But he tried to make it right. That has to count for something. Ennepe looked at her, really looked at her. This woman who had lost everything, who carried her husband's guilt along with his unfinished work, who stood in front of her children with nothing but determination, keeping her upright. His anger did not disappear, but it shifted, redirected toward the man who had used Lucian's knowledge and then discarded him like a tool that had outlived its usefulness. He tried to fix it. Ennepe said finally, "That is more than most men do." He paused, jaw working. "But it does not change what we must do now." "No." Rose agreed, her voice steadier. "It does not." Helene studied the plans again, running her finger along the marked channel. A handwritten note in Kincaid's hand, penned in the margin, described using dynamite at the spring thaw to clear debris and redirect flow, right where the relief channel ran toward Lakota burial grounds and the last independent farms. "This is not just about stealing water," she said slowly. "He means to flood them out and call it nature. When the ice breaks, that whole valley will be a muddy grave." Nehemiah paled. How many people live in that low ground? 50, maybe more. Ennepe's voice was tight. Elders, children, families who cannot move fast. Now they knew the true deadline. Stopping Kincaid was not only about justice. It was about keeping hundreds of bodies from washing downriver in a torrent of mud and broken ice. Rose looked at Ennepe. "I am sorry. For what Lucian did. For what it cost you." Ennepe met her eyes. After a long moment he said, "He tried to fix it. That is more than most men do." He paused. "We honor him by finishing what he started." Rose nodded, blinking back tears. "Yes, we do." They left Nehemiah's house as the sun set, moving through the alleys with new urgency. The countdown had begun. The ice on the creek was already thinning, groaning under the weight of snowmelt from the high country. They had days, maybe a week, before the thaw turned deadly. Kincaid moved first. Guided by rumors of a Lakota warrior riding with a white widow, Rusty Joe led armed men to the winter camp just before dawn, when fires were low and horses were still tethered. They attacked without warning. Shots ripped through lodge walls, tearing hide and splintering poles. Flames leaped in the dry material fed by wind and oil-soaked rags tied to arrows. Screams blended with the crackle of burning wood. Children stumbled out into the snow, coughing, crying, pulled by mothers who shielded them with their own bodies. Ennepe woke to the sound of Martin coughing and smoke, small bodies shaking with each spasm. He dragged the boy out into the snow, shoved Lottie toward the trees, and thrust the baby into Rose's arms. Follow the creek, he ordered, voice hard. Stay low. Do not stop. He and McGeesy used fallen logs as cover, firing at shadowed shapes among the lodges. One of Kincaid's riders went down, clutching his leg and screaming. Another tossed torches into a food store, and the smell of burning meat and grain filled the air. Amid the chaos, a gunman on horseback hauled Owen off his feet, jamming a pistol to the boy's ribs and dragging him onto the saddle. Owen kicked and fought, but the man was too strong. You want him, Rusty Joe yelled over the crackling blaze, reining in his horse at the edge of camp. Bring Kincaid's papers to the dam before the thaw, or I drop him in the spillway and let the water do the rest. Enepe tried for a shot, but Rusty Joe spurred his horse behind a burning lodge, using the smoke as cover. Return fire forced Enepe back. A bullet punched into McGeesy's chest with a wet, heavy sound. The old man slumped against his nephew, blood steaming on the snow breath, coming in shallow, rattling gasps. You find another path, McGeesy whispered, his hand squeezing Enepe's arm with desperate strength. One where we are not always running. His hand fell limp. Enepe knelt in the snow, cradling his uncle's body rage and grief warring in his chest. Around him, the camp lay in ruins, lodges smoking black against the white ground, families huddled in shock and terror. As the attackers retreated, Ayanna emerged from the trees, where she had hidden with the younger children. Her face was ashen, streaked with soot. She approached the council of elders slowly, her steps hesitant. I told them, she said, voice barely above a whisper. I told Rusty Joe where the camp was. Enepe's head snapped up. Rose, holding the baby, went rigid. The gathered Lakota turned to stare at Ayanna, faces hardening with betrayal. They came to me 3 days ago. Ayanna continued, tears streaming down her face. They said if I told them where you were hiding, they would leave the rest of us alone. They said they only wanted the white woman and her papers. I thought I was protecting the children. I thought they would keep their word. An elder woman spat into the snow at Ayanna's feet. You brought death to your own people. I know, Ayanna sobbed. I know. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Enepe stood slowly still, holding McGeesy's body. His face was a mask of grief and fury. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then he said, his voice cold. You believed Kincaid's men would keep a promise. That was foolish. But you were afraid. Fear makes us do terrible things. He laid McGeesy's body gently on the ground, closing the old man's eyes with his fingertips. Then he turned to the council. I do not ask you to forgive her, but I ask you to remember that she is young and she was trying to protect you. The true enemy is Kincaid. He used her fear against us. That is what he does. He finds the cracks and he widens them until we break. The council panicked, and grieving gathered in the cold light of dawn. Some blamed Enepe outright for bringing a white woman into their midst. Others simply wanted the danger gone before more blood was spilled. The decision was swift and brutal. Enepe was ordered to leave and take Rose's family with him. Ayanna, shamed and weeping, was cast out as well. Wounded in the shoulder by a grazing round, exhausted and outnumbered, Enepe was in no condition to fight them. He knew any further argument would only risk more blood, more division. With what little help they would spare, a small sack of cornmeal, 2 blankets, a water skin, he hitched Rose's weary horse to the wagon once more. Ayanna approached him as he prepared to leave. Let me come with you, she said. Let me try to make this right. Enepe studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded curtly. Get in the wagon. They drove into the hills, heading into a tightening gray sky. Snow turned to sleet, sharp and stinging. The only shelter ahead was an old silver mine cut into a bluff across a half-frozen river. To reach it, they had to cross a narrow wooden bridge. planks slick with ice and age. Midway across, a support plank snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The wagon lurched sideways, one wheel hanging over the rushing water below. The horse panicked hooves scrambling for purchase, the whole cart teetering on the edge. Martin cried out, clutching the side of the wagon. Lottie grabbed him, holding tight. Rose braced herself, arms locked around the baby. Enepe tied a rope around his waist and passed the free end to Rose. "If I fall, pull," he said, voice clipped with pain and urgency. He eased along the tilted wagon boots, slipping on wet planks, and wedged his shoulder against the stuck wheel. Every movement sent fire through his wounded side. Rose braced herself on the bridge rope, looped around her hips and shoulders, digging her heels into the boards. Lottie and Ayanna gripped the rail with frozen fingers, leaning back to add their weight. "Push when I count," Enepe called, voice tight. 1, 2, 3. His bad shoulders screamed when he heaved, muscles tearing. But the wheel finally slammed back onto the boards with a heavy thud. Rose and the others hauled on the rope, dragging him the last few feet out of danger as icy spray lashed his legs. By the time they reached the mine, everyone was shaking with cold and shock. Inside, they found an old handcart, some rotting timbers, and a pocket of still air out of the wind. The mine smelled of damp stone and rust, but it was dry and out of sight. Rose arranged blankets into a rough nest near the wall, settling the baby among warm bodies. The older children huddled close, bone-tired eyes hollow. There was one chunk of jerked meat and half a canteen of water left. Without comment, Rose cut the meat into 6 thin strips, now that Ayanna was with them, pushing the thickest toward Enepe, then sliding the canteen across the dirt to him. When he reached for it, he noticed that her hands were trembling from exhaustion and thirst. He took only a quick swallow and then set the canteen within her reach instead of his own. No speech, no argument. Just a quiet trade of precious ounces and acknowledgement that they were in this together and neither would survive alone. Ayanna sat apart from the others, knees drawn to her chest, face buried in her hands. Rose looked at her for a long moment, then crossed the space between them and sat down beside her. She did not speak at first, just sat close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "I know what it is to make a choice that haunts you," Rose said quietly. "To think you are doing the right thing and then watch it fall apart." Ayanna looked up, eyes red and swollen. "How do you live with it? You do not forget. You carry it. But you also keep moving forward. You try to do better the next time." Rose paused. "My husband made a choice that cost lives. He tried to fix it, but he ran out of time. You still have time. You can still help us stop Kincaid." Ayanna wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I will do whatever I can." Later, as they sat back to back for warmth, sharing the same flattened blanket while the children slept, Rose murmured into the darkness, "I used to think if I could just keep my land, everything would be all right. Now there is no land, no roof, and still we are breathing." Enepe answered, eyes on the tunnel mouth where pale light filtered in. "Land can be taken. Water can be stolen. The ones who stand beside you when you have nothing, that is what you keep." He tilted his head just enough that she could feel the weight of him against her shoulder. It was not a caress, but a shared anchor in a place where the world kept shifting beneath their feet. Outside, the thaw began. Somewhere upstream, ice groaned against the dam, cracking and shifting with the pressure of meltwater building behind it. With Owen held hostage and the dam wired for blasting, there was no time to wait for perfect strength or better odds. At first light, Enepe, Rose, the children, Ayanna, Nehemiah, and Helene left the mine, cutting across frozen draws to avoid patrols. The river beside them ran high and mean, with meltwater roaring over rocks, chunks of ice breaking loose and spinning away downstream. The sound was deafening, a constant thunder that made conversation impossible. They climbed a narrow service path up the canyon wall toward the dam, a raw wall of timber and rock, holding back a churning lake of half-broken ice. The path was little more than a ledge, slick with melt and moss, barely wide enough for single file. Enipe led jaw tight against the pain in his shoulder and leg, every step carefully placed. His vision swam occasionally black spots dancing at the edges, but he forced himself forward. Rose came behind him, one hand lightly near his back, not steadying unless he slipped, but ready. Behind her came the children, and then Ayanna, and then Nehemiah and Helene, bringing up the rear. The climb took nearly an hour. Twice loose rock gave way under their feet, sending stones tumbling into the gorge below. Martin whimpered when a particularly large chunk broke free just beside him, but Lottie grabbed his hand and pulled him forward. At the top they saw dynamite barrels stacked near a small shed, fuses coiled like snakes on a wooden crate. Owen stood tied to a post near the spillway hands, bound behind him, a gag stuffed in his mouth. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut. Rusty Joe's pistol hovered too close to the boy's head. Victor Kincaid waited with a handful of riders, strong Steve at his right side. The big dam trembled under their boots. With the force of the water it held timbers, groaning spray, rising in cold clouds that soaked everyone within seconds. The lake behind the dam was a churning mass of ice and black water, pressing against the wooden wall with relentless force. Every few seconds, a loud crack echoed as another piece of ice broke free and slammed into the dam face. Nehemiah stepped forward, holding the copied ledger pages high, his voice shaking but clear. "These are already on their way east," he called over the roar of water. "The judge will see every forged signature, every payment. You cannot bury this, Kincaid." Kincaid stood near the edge of the dam, his face flushed from the climb and his own fury. He was a man in his 50s, broad-shouldered and used to getting his way. A long coat flapped around his legs, brass buttons catching the weak morning light. He shrugged, almost casual, but there was murder in his eyes. "Let him read," Kincaid said, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "The creek will have a new path by then, and all those pretty papers will not raise a drowned shack from the mud, or a drowned family for that matter." He nodded to Rusty Joe, who flicked open a matchbox and lit a fuse running toward the dynamite. The fuse hissed and sparked, racing toward the barrels. It was a long fuse, Enipe noted, maybe 3 minutes before it reached the powder. Kincaid wanted them to watch to feel the fear build. "You have time to make the right choice." Kincaid called his tone almost conversational. "Hand over the papers, all of them. Walk away. I will even let the boy go. No one else needs to die today." Enipe bolted along the catwalk, boots sliding on wet boards, trying to reach the sputtering fuse. His wounded leg almost buckled under him, but he pushed through the pain. Bullets from Kincaid's riders pinged off the stone around him, ricocheting with high, whining sounds. One grazed his opposite arm, tearing through his sleeve and drawing a line of blood. He stumbled, but kept moving, driven by desperation. The fuse was still burning, sparks flying now, about 2 minutes from the barrels. From behind a spillway brace, Rose lined up, Nehemiah's rifle hand steady despite the wind and spray. Her heart pounded in her ears, louder than the roar of the water. She could not risk a shot at Rusty Joe without endangering Owen. Instead, she remembered Enipe's lesson about aiming where you could do the most good with the least risk. She drew a sharp breath, sighted carefully, and fired at the rope binding her son. The shot was clean. The rope snapped, fraying apart. Owen flung himself sideways, rolling away from the edge just as Rusty Joe cursed and grabbed at empty air. The boy scrambled to his feet, yanked the gag from his mouth, and ran diving behind a stack of timber where Helene pulled him close. Rusty Joe, enraged, turned his pistol toward Rose. You just signed your death warrant, lady. Before he could fire, Strong Steve stepped forward and knocked Rusty Joe's arm upward. The shot went wild, vanishing into the sky. Rusty Joe wheeled on Steve, confusion and fury warring on his scarred face. "What in blazes are you doing?" Rusty Joe snarled. "I am done," Steve said flatly. "I am done watching innocents die for a man who cares nothing for anyone but himself." On the far side of the dam, Victor Kincaid, seeing control slip through his fingers, stalked toward the dynamite shed. His face twisted with rage. "You miserable coward," he spat at Steve. "After everything I have done for you." "You have done nothing but use me," Steve replied. "Just like you used Lucian Holloway, just like you use everyone." The revelation hung in the air. Kincaid's eyes narrowed. "So you finally figured it out." Lucian was weak. He could not see the bigger picture. "But you, I thought you were smarter." Inside the shed, in a makeshift cradle of blankets, lay the newborn. Kincaid scooped the baby up his hand, clamped around the small body like a threat. He lifted the child high over the churning spillway below, one-handed, his other hand gripping a timber brace for balance. "Enough!" Kincaid snarled, his voice raw and desperate. "You hand me the ledger, the copies, and that red savage lays down his gun. Or this little piece of nothing takes a long fall and you can all watch him drown." Rose's blood turned to ice. A scream tore from her throat, primal and desperate. "No, please, not my baby," Lottie screamed. Martin buried his face in Ayana's coat. Nehemiah went pale. Enepe froze on the catwalk, caught between the fuse now, about 90 seconds from the barrels, and the baby dangling over the deadly water. The fuse continued to burn, hissing and spitting sparks. 80 seconds. Strong Steve, standing at Kincaid's shoulder, flinched. He had dragged dead calves from floodwaters, seen men washed into ravines when poorly stacked logs gave way. But a baby, a helpless infant, was a line his stomach could not cross. He had followed orders for years, looked the other way, when convenient, justified every brutal act as necessary. But this was different. From the hillside above, Helene raised her voice, sharp and urgent, cutting through the roar of water. "Steve, when this dam breaks the way he drew it, it will take your bunkhouse too. Your own men, your own kin. They are all on those lower pastures. Your brother's family, your niece. They will all drown." The words landed harder than any argument about law or justice. Steve's eyes flicked from the roaring water behind the dam to the shivering child in Kincaid's grip and the desperate line of farmers with rifles on the far bank. He thought of his younger brother, who worked the cattle down in the valley. His niece, who lived in a cabin near the creek. He thought of Lucian Holloway, his old friend from the railroad survey, who had tried to stop this and died for it. Slowly, with hands that trembled, Steve drew his revolver and leveled it. Not at Rose, not at Enepe, but at his boss. "Put the baby down, Victor," he said, voice flat and hard. Kincaid wheeled toward him in disbelief. "You miserable hired hand. You think you can—" His foot skidded on the slick board's heel, catching a patch of ice where spray had frozen in the cold air. For a heartbeat, he pinwheeled, clutching the baby tighter arms, flailing for balance. The infant wailed, a thin, terrified sound that cut through everything else. Then Kincaid's heel hit the ice again, and he pitched sideways toward the spillway, his grip on the timber breaking. Enepe was closest. He dropped his rifle dove along the catwalk in a bruising slide that tore open his wounded thigh and sent fresh blood soaking through his trousers. His vision grayed at the edges from the pain, but he managed to hook an arm around the baby's wrapped body as Kincaid tumbled over the low wall. There was a thud and a terrible cut-short scream as Victor's body slammed into rocks below and vanished into the churning foam. The spray swallowed him in seconds. Enepe curled around the child, skidding hard enough to skin his knees and reopen the wound in his shoulder. He slammed into the parapet with a force that drove the breath from his lungs, stars exploding in his vision. But the baby in his arms was alive and bawling face screwed up in startled, furious rage. The fuse continued to burn. 60 seconds. Enepe, shaking from shock and pain, could barely move. His hands were slippery with blood, his own mixed with spray from the dam. He tried to push himself up, but his injured leg would not hold him. He collapsed back against the parapet, cradling the baby, knowing he was too far from the fuse to reach it in time. Rose saw him fall. Without thinking, she sprinted across the catwalk, boots pounding on wet boards, rifle forgotten. Bullets whined past her. Rusty Joe was firing wild, now panicked, but she did not slow. She reached Enepe and dropped to her knees beside him, taking the screaming baby and checking him over with frantic hands. No blood, no broken bones, just terrified and cold. The fuse? Enepe gasped, pointing. 40 seconds, maybe less. Rose looked at the crackling line racing toward the dynamite, and then at her children huddled behind the timber stack, then at the people gathered on both sides of the dam, farmers, Lakota riders, Helene, Nehemiah, all of them about to be blown into the gorge if that powder went up. She thrust the baby into Ayanna's arms as the young woman reached them. "Hold him," Rose ordered, then ran for the fuse. 30 seconds. Her boots slipped on the boards, and she went down hard on one knee, crying out as pain shot up her leg. She scrambled forward on hands and knees, eyes fixed on the sparking fuse. 20 seconds. Strong Steve saw what she was trying to do. He fired his revolver at Rusty Joe, forcing the scarred man to dive for cover, then ran to help Rose. Together, they reached the fuse with 15 seconds to spare. Rose grabbed it in both hands, feeling the heat singe her palms, and snapped it between her fingers. The fuse broke. The spark died with a hiss. For a moment, the only sound was the roar of the water and the ragged breathing of terrified people. Then Rusty Joe, seeing his employer dead and his own chances evaporating, made a desperate lunge for one of the dynamite barrels. He pulled a match from his pocket, striking it against his boot. Enepe, still slumped against the parapet, raised his rifle with shaking hands and fired. The shot took Rusty Joe in the shoulder, spinning him around. The lit match flew from his fingers, arcing through the air, and landed in a puddle of spray, where it hissed out harmlessly. Rusty Joe collapsed, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face gone gray with shock and pain. Strong Steve walked over and kicked the man's pistol away, then stood over him with his own weapon drawn. "It is over," he said. "It is done." Across the dam, Rusty Joe saw his employer gone, his boss's right hand turned against him, and dozens of rifles trained on his chest. He let his good hand fall limp and closed his eyes, defeated. The dam held. The dynamite did not blow. The valley's future hung for the first time on choices rather than on one man's greed. Rose sank down onto the wet boards, her hands blistered from the fuse, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and relief. Enepe, using the parapet to pull himself upright, limped over to her and offered his hand. She took it, and he hauled her to her feet. For a moment, they just stood there, hands clasped, looking at each other with the weight of everything they had survived written in their eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you," she echoed. Around them, people began to emerge from cover, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. The danger had passed. The valley was safe. Within hours, the balance shifted like a river changing course. Farmers and Lakota riders alike gathered at the dam, no longer enemies, but wary allies, bound by survival. The sight of Kincaid's body being pulled from the rocks downstream, broken and lifeless, seemed to release something in the valley, a collective breath held too long. Under Nehemiah's careful eye, and with Strong Steve's practical know-how, they started cutting controlled notches in the dam and building simple sluice gates so water could be shared without wiping anyone out. Steve proved invaluable, his knowledge of Kincaid's construction revealing weak points that needed immediate reinforcement. He worked alongside farmers and Lakota men, his silence speaking louder than any apology. The sheriff, a cautious man named Dawes, who had spent years looking the other way, finally found his backbone when he saw Kincaid's body recovered downstream and read the ledger copy Helene pinned to the courthouse door with a knife. Rusty Joe and two of the worst gun hands were arrested and marched under guard toward the jail wrists, bound with the same rope they had used on Owen. Strong Steve handed over his own revolver and offered a flat, unvarnished confession. That flood would have taken my bunkhouse, too. He admitted, voice rough with shame. My own brother's family. I am done helping men who think we are all just numbers on a page. He paused, then added, Lucian Holloway was my friend once. I should have stood with him when it mattered. I did not. But I am standing now. Enepe, light-headed from blood loss, and the exertion on the dam, stumbled as he tried to walk back toward the wagons. Rose was there immediately, arms around his waist, taking his weight without complaint. I have got you, she said, her voice soft but firm. With her support, he made it to Nehemiah's buggy, where the doctor immediately set to work cleaning and stitching the reopened wounds. At the clinic in Sapphire Springs, Nehemiah and Helene worked by lamplight as the sun set, stitching torn flesh and binding broken ribs. Rose sat in a straight-back chair near the door boots, still muddy, the baby asleep in her lap, ready to move if one of the children cried or if trouble came crashing in. She did not hover or pace. When Enepe woke on the narrow cot hours later, he saw her asleep in the chair chin, tipped to her chest, one hand resting protectively on the baby's back. She had clearly stayed there through the changing of bandages, through the commotion in the street, as news spread through the first stirrings of a town, unsure what came next. Outside, the sound was different. Hammer blows shouted directions, the creak of wagons not evacuating but hauling lumber back toward homesteads and the edge of Lakota ground. Men who had been strangers a week ago now worked side by side, arguing good-naturedly over the best way to dig a channel or shore up a bank. Owen, freed and shaken, but recovering, helped carry tools and fetch water for the workers. Lottie stayed close to Ayanna, the two of them grinding corn and weaving cord together, a tentative friendship forming from shared guilt and redemption. Martin played with Lakota children in the muddy street, their laughter high and bright in the cool air, a sound the valley had not heard in too long. Ayanna worked tirelessly, as if trying to atone through sheer effort. She helped the women prepare meals for the workers' tended injuries, carried messages between groups. Slowly, the hard look softened. Forgiveness would take time, but acceptance was beginning. The valley was healing slowly, one nail and one agreement at a time. 3 weeks later, the thaw was complete. Spring rains fell soft and steady, filling the creek without flooding it. The creek ran full but not wild, braided through new gates, overseen by a joint council. Lakota elders, small farmers, Helene, Nehemiah, Strong Steve, and even a few reformed cowhands who had worked for Kincaid but wanted no part of his legacy. They signed a legal agreement copied 3 times and witnessed by a traveling judge from the territorial capital that split water rights fairly and protected the burial grounds from any future damming. Victor Kincaid's lands were broken up under investigation for fraud. Some parcels went to men he had cheated, families whose wells he had poisoned, whose fences he had torn down, whose lives he had tried to erase. One narrow strip hugging the creek, including the ashes of her old homestead, was confirmed to Rose under Lucian's original now-cleaned claim. The territorial government, embarrassed by the scandal and the national attention Helene's copies of the ledger had drawn, moved quickly to settle disputes and restore order. On a warm spring afternoon, with wildflowers beginning to bloom in sheltered draws, Rose and her children hammered fence posts along the edge of that strip. The fences were low just enough to keep the milk cow from wandering and the horse from straying to the steep cutbanks. They were not meant to keep people out, only to mark where responsibility began. Lakota riders moved freely along the creek, beyond driving a small herd toward better grass, with the council's blessing. Children played in the shallows, splashing and laughing, no longer separated by fear or mistrust. The sound of their joy carried on the wind. Enepe rode up the slope on his bay gelding and dismounted, moving carefully, but without the pronounced limp that had once made every step a visible struggle. His shoulder had healed well, the stitches long since removed, leaving only pale scars that would fade with time. He walked to where Rose was wrestling a stubborn post into a rocky hole, sweat beading on her forehead, despite the cool breeze. "You are fighting the ground wrong?" he said, picking up a spare digging bar and allowing himself a small smile. "You push straight and it pushes back. Let it lean a little." He drove the bar in at an angle, loosened the stones, then braced the post while she shoveled packed dirt in around it. There was no hurry. They fell into an easy rhythm. He steadied. She shoveled, the post settled solid. It felt natural, like they had been working side by side for years instead of weeks. Down by the creek, Owen practiced with a lariat alongside Lakota boys his age, laughing when he missed and trying again with good-natured determination. Lottie helped Ayanna hang strips of jerked meat on drying racks, learning the old songs that went with the work, her young voice blending with Ayanna's. Martin splashed in the shallows, chased by a pair of giggling Lakota toddlers, all of them soaked and happy, their childhood briefly restored. When the post finally stood straight, Rose propped her shovel and looked out over the valley's shared grazing cabins and teepees, both catching the same wind at the dam in the distance, now watched by more than one pair of eyes. The sky was wide and blue, scattered with clouds that promised more rain later, but no threat. Birdsong filled the air, robins and meadowlarks claiming territory. "I thought the best I could hope for was a roof that did not leak," she said quietly. "Now there is all this, and I do not know what to call it." Enepe leaned on the post beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, both of them facing forward toward the horizon. "Call it a place that will fight back when someone tries to steal it," he answered. After a beat, he added, "If you want another pair of hands to keep it that way, I can stay near. Ride the line, watch the water, help with the fences and the planting." She studied his profile, the healed scar at his temple, the steady way his eyes tracked the curve of the creek, the bay horse grazing patiently nearby. She thought about the weeks behind them, the blood and fear and impossible choices. She thought about the way he had curled his body around her baby on the dam, willing to die rather than let the child fall. She thought about the quiet moments between them, the shared blankets and rationed water, the trust built not from words but from actions. "Then do not just ride past," she said, her voice soft but certain. She walked to the cradle set in the grass and lifted the baby, now rounder and loud, with life cheeks pink and healthy eyes bright with curiosity. She carried him back and without ceremony placed the child in Enepe's arms. "If this is going to be a place that fights back," she said, "he ought to know the hands that held him when everything else was falling apart." Enepe cradled the boy the same way he had on the dam, but with sun on his face instead of ice in his hair and death at his heels. The baby grabbed a fistful of his braid and crowed, tugging hard and babbling nonsense syllables. Enepe smiled, slow and genuine, a rare expression that softened the hard lines around his mouth and made him look younger, less burdened. Rose laughed, short, surprised, unpracticed, and did not take the baby back. Instead, she stood beside Enepe, shoulder to shoulder, watching the valley come alive with the work of people who had decided to stay and build rather than run and hide. That evening, as the sun set in streaks of orange and purple, a long table was set up in the open ground between the new cabins and the Lakota camp. It was a rough thing, planks laid across sawhorses, but it held the weight of the shared meal-roasted venison brought by the Lakota hunters' cornbread, baked by Rose and Lottie wild greens, gathered by Ayanna and the other women, and a pot of beans that Nehemiah contributed from his own stores. People gathered slowly, tentative at first, but hunger and curiosity drew them in. Farmers sat beside Lakota elders. Children scrambled for places near their friends, regardless of which side of the creek they came from. Helene said a brief, non-sectarian blessing, thanking the land and the people for their resilience. The meal was eaten with more laughter than anyone had heard in months. Stories were told, some somber remembering those lost, but others full of humor and hope. Strong Steve sat at the far end of the table, quiet but present, and when Owen shyly asked him about surveying, Steve talked about his work with Lucian, his voice thick with old grief, but also with a kind of peace. As the stars came out, Enepe found himself sitting between Rose and Ayanna, the baby asleep in his lap, warm and solid. Rose's hand rested lightly on his arm, not possessive, just there, a point of connection. Across the table, Martin was teaching a Lakota boy how to make a whistle from a blade of grass, their heads bent together in concentration. This is what Magisi wanted. Enepe said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. A path where we are not always running. Rose squeezed his arm gently. Then we walk it together. The last image widened the creek, flashing in starlight, shared fields running green with new grass, and the promise of harvest Lakota riders and settler wagons crossing the same ford without hesitation or fear. On the small rise above, a Lakota warrior and a widowed homesteader stood together under the vast Montana sky, a child in his arms, fence posts set not as prison bars, but as markers of a home they were choosing to guard together. In the distance, night birds called to one another, their songs weaving through the darkness. The valley had been broken, its people scattered and afraid. Now it was being rebuilt, one choice, one fence post, one shared meal at a time. And for the first time in a long time, the people who lived there believed it might last. The future was uncertain, as it always was on the frontier. But they would face it together, with clear water running through the valley and promises kept instead of broken.